Welcome to the deep dive. You're probably seeing headlines flying around about recent executive actions,
Hmm.
and we know you want to understand what these really mean, beyond the political spin.
Exactly.
So today, we're diving straight into the actual text of several of these orders. We want to try and uncover their potential impact on your life and on the country generally.
Yeah, and we've got a real mix here. Everything from commemorating history to changing how the government actually buys things.
Right. Our mission really is to cut through the stated goals, the official language, and analyze the likely real-world consequences for regular folks, for businesses, and for, key policy areas.
And just to be clear, we're not taking sides. Our job is to look at these documents, analyze them, and sort of distill the potential effects.
Okay.
We're talking about orders on historical commemorations, federal contracts, critical minerals, a federal hiring freeze, drug prices, Social Security benefits,
Okay.
seafood regulations, federal office space, government procurement, even Pacific fishing and infrastructure permitting. A lot to cover.
Yeah, sounds like it. Each one could potentially create ripples, right, in our daily lives. So let's get into it.
Let's do it.
Okay, let's unpack this first one. It's a proclamation marking the 250th anniversary of the battles of Lexington and Concord.
Right.
It's full of really powerful patriotic language, call of freedom, British regime's reign of tyranny. It talks about Paul Revere's ride, the start of the war.
Very evocative stuff.
Yeah. But if we strip away that rhetoric, what's the actual, tangible effect of this proclamation?
Well, what's interesting here, I think, is that it's almost purely symbolic. Its main purpose really is just to honor a historical event and reinforce a particular story about American identity, the nation's founding.
Okay.
The language definitely aims to stir up national pride, shot heard around the world, all that.
So for the listener, for you listening, the main effect is just hearing that story again, reinforcing it.
Pretty much. There aren't any new rules or programs here that are going to directly impact your day-to-day. It's really just a commemorative gesture.
So no change in your taxes, no change in local services because of this one.
Oh.
What about any actual benefits for wealthy people or businesses? Does remembering a battle translate to a stronger bottom line for anyone?
It's hard to see how, any benefit would be super indirect, maybe through fostering a general sense of national unity, perhaps, but a direct financial advantage for specific groups. Very unlikely from something like this.
Right.
It's more like official storytelling, creating that shared sense of the past.
Okay, makes sense. A formal nod to history. Now let's shift to something with maybe more concrete effects. This executive order about ensuring commercial, cost-effective solutions in federal contracts.
Yes, procurement.
The basic idea seems to be pushing the government to buy more readily available, off-the-shelf products and services instead of, custom-built stuff. What's behind this push?
Well, the order itself claims that previous administrations sort of evaded statutory preferences. It specifically mentions the Federal Acquisition Streamlining Act, FASASA. And it says they abused the federal contracting framework, leading to spending that they call unnecessary and imprudent, and that it stifled innovation.
So the policy is basically use FASA more. Buy commercial when you can.
Exactly. It puts a renewed emphasis on that. Buy commercial items to the maximum extent practicable. The order even makes agencies review their current requests for non-commercial items and justify why they need something custom using market research and price analysis.
So the government's being told to shop more like the rest of us might.
Kind of.
What could the real impact be on the average person? Could this actually save taxpayers money? Or are there, potential downsides?
That's the key question for you, isn't it? In theory, buying commercial could lead to lower government spending, which, might eventually mean some savings for taxpayers down the line. But you have to think about the practical side. What if commercial options just aren't good enough for really specialized government needs? Think advanced military gear or unique scientific equipment.
Right. Could impact the quality of those services.
Potentially, yeah. Or the efficiency. It's a balance.
That's a really important point. What about businesses? Who wins and who loses if the government shifts more towards commercial products?
Well, the likely winners are companies that already make commercial products and services the government might use. This could open up a much bigger market for them.
And the losers?
Probably businesses that have built their model around creating those custom design solutions specifically for the government, they might see fewer opportunities.
Okay. So framed as cost saving, But success depends on whether good enough commercial options actually exist for everything the government needs.
Precisely.
All right, let's dig into this next one. An executive order on processed critical minerals. This one talks about national security, economic resilience, focusing on things like rare earth elements and uranium. Why the focus on these specific minerals?
Yeah, this one's interesting. The order argues that the U.S. relies too heavily on just a small number of foreign suppliers for these processed minerals, and that creates big vulnerabilities.
The vulnerability is how?
Well, these minerals are apparently essential for a whole range of critical sectors: transportation, energy, telecom, advanced manufacturing, plus, of course, national security and defense systems.
Okay.
So the concerns are things like supply chain disruptions, maybe from geopolitical tensions or natural disasters, also the possibility of foreign producers manipulating prices.
And the impact on U.S. manufacturing overall.
Exactly, that too.
So what's the order actually do about these vulnerabilities?
The main action it mandates is for the Secretary of Commerce to launch what's called a Section 232 investigation.
Section 232.
Yeah, it's a specific type of investigation that assesses whether imports are threatening national security. It'll look at, where these mineral imports are coming from, how much is coming in, any signs of foreign market manipulation, what our domestic production capability looks like, and what potential remedies could be used.
Remedies like what? Tariffs?
Could be tariffs, yeah. Or import restrictions, but also potentially incentives to boost domestic production here in the U.S.
Okay, so how might this affect you, the listener? Tariffs on minerals sound like they can make everyday stuff more expensive.
That's a very real possibility. If tariffs or import restrictions get slapped on, the cost of lots of goods that use these critical minerals, think smartphones, cars, components for renewable energy.
Right, all sorts of things.
Yeah, those costs could go up, which could hit consumer prices. On the flip side, if it does spur more domestic production, that could create jobs in those mining and processing sectors.
So it's pitched as national security, but there are definite potential economic consequences for consumers to watch out for.
Absolutely. It's a trade-off.
Okay, let's move on. The extension of the federal civilian hiring freeze. This started earlier, and now it's being extended again for a few more months. What does this freeze actually involve?
So this memo extends the hiring freeze through July 15th, 2025. And it applies pretty broadly, basically all executive departments and agencies. Meaning, generally they can't fill vacant positions and they can't create new ones during this period. The stated reason is to give time to adopt a new merit hiring plan and also a broader workforce reduction plan.
But I remember there were some pretty big exceptions to this freeze, weren't there? Certain areas were protected.
That's right. It doesn't apply to military personnel or positions involved in immigration enforcement, national security, public safety, or the president's own office, the EOP.
And importantly for listeners.
Right. Crucially for many people listening, it also exempts jobs that directly affect delivering Social Security, Medicare, or veterans benefits.
Okay, that's key.
Plus, the head of OPM, the Office of Personnel Management, can grant more exemptions if needed. And agencies aren't supposed to just contract out work to get around the freeze. They can reassign current staff to meet priority needs, though. Oh, and there is a specific condition for the IRS. The freeze stays until the Treasury Secretary says ending it is in the national interest.
And unions, collective bargaining.
The memo explicitly says it doesn't override existing collective bargaining agreements.
Okay, so how might this impact the average person's interaction with the government? Are you likely to see a noticeable change in services?
Well, the potential effect for you is that if agencies not covered by exemptions become understaffed, it could lead to delays. Or maybe a dip in the quality of some government services you use.
Even with the exemptions?
Yeah, the exemptions protect critical functions, but a long freeze can definitely strain the capacity of many agencies.
And what about the supposed benefits? It's often framed as saving taxpayer money. Any real upside for the wealthy or businesses here?
Well, the stated goal is long-term savings, yes, but immediate benefits for the wealthy or businesses are less clear. Maybe some companies could get more contracts if agencies are struggling. But overall, it probably creates more uncertainty for businesses that deal with federal agencies regularly.
Okay, let's switch gears to something that hits home for a lot of people. Prescription drug prices. There's an executive order called Lowering Drug Prices by once again putting Americans first. Pretty clear title. It also seems critical of the Inflation Reduction Act, What's the main thrust here?
Yeah, the primary stated goal is definitely lowering drug costs for patients and taxpayers. The order says it builds on past efforts, but specifically aims to, quote, improve upon the Inflation Reduction Act, or IRA.
Improve how? What are the criticisms?
It claims the IRA is administratively complex and expensive, hasn't saved as much as projected, and has caused problems in Medicare Part D, like inflated premiums and diminished coverage choices. It even mentions a potential taxpayer-funded bailout.
Wow. Okay.
It also brings up something called the pill penalty, suggesting the IRA might discourage innovation for traditional pill form drugs versus biologics.
Got it. So what specific actions does this order actually direct? It looks like a pretty long list.
It is quite comprehensive. It tells the Secretary of Health and Human Services, HHS, to propose new guidance for the Medicare Drug Price Negotiation Program. The idea is to prioritize really high-cost drugs, but also try to minimize any negative impact on pharmaceutical innovation.
Okay.
It also asks for recommendations on how to stabilize or reduce Medicare Part D premiums. And it wants HHS to work with Congress to basically treat small molecule drugs and biologics similarly in the negotiation program.
Anything else major?
Yes, quite a bit more. It wants a new payment model developed and tested to improve Medicare's value for high-cost drugs, even ones not in the negotiation program. It mandates a plan to survey what hospitals actually pay for outpatient drugs and maybe adjust Medicare payments based on that. Plus, joint recommendations on improving Medicaid drug rebates, payment methods, value-based payments, and helping states manage drug spending.
That is a lot. And it keeps going. Insulin competition.
It does. It also includes directing that grants for health centers be conditioned on them making insulin and epinephrine available at lower prices for low-income folks with high cost sharing or no insurance.
That seems pretty direct.
Yeah. Then there are calls for recommendations to make the whole pharmaceutical supply chain more competitive, efficient, and transparent. The FDA is tasked with finding ways to speed up generic and biosimilar approvals, combination products, and moving some prescription drugs to over-the-counter status.
Oh.
Steps to streamline the prescription drug importation program. Regulations to stop Medicare payments from incentivizing drug administration in expensive hospital settings. The Labor Secretary needs to propose rules for more transparency on how pharmacy benefit managers, PBMs, get paid by employer health plans.
PVMs are often controversial.
They are. And finally, public listening sessions and a report on reducing anti-competitive behavior by drug manufacturers.
Okay, phew. That's a massive agenda. The intended outcome seems clear: lower drug costs, better access. But what's the likely real impact on you, the listener?
Well, the aim is definitely making meds more affordable and accessible. Especially things like insulin and potentially stabilizing Medicare premiums would help seniors directly.
Right.
But the actual impact really hinges on the specific rules that get written and whether Congress actually acts on the legislative parts. And that stated concern about not hurting innovation, that could also limit how much prices actually come down.
Right. And who in the business world might see changes? Winners and losers.
Well, drug manufacturers could definitely face more pressure on prices and rebates. More generics, biosimilars, maybe more imports that could squeeze profits for brand name drugs.
And PBMs.
PBMs could face a lot more scrutiny on their business practices and fees. On the flip side, health centers and low-income individuals might see pretty direct benefits from that insulin and epinephrine provision.
Sounds like a very ambitious plan.
Eh.
But implementation and industry pushback will be key.
Absolutely. The devil's in the details, as always.
Okay, let's shift now to a presidential memorandum about preventing illegal aliens from getting Social Security Act benefits. What's the core instruction here?
The main directive is pretty clear. Take steps to make sure that people classified as ineligible aliens don't receive benefits under the Social Security Act. It specifically refers back to an earlier order about ending taxpayer subsidization of open borders.
Right.
And it reinforces the idea that benefits should only go to eligible people and shouldn't, encourage illegal immigration.
So what specific actions does the memo order to make this happen?
It tells the Secretaries of Labor and HHS and the Commissioner of Social Security to implement measures to stop ineligible aliens getting funds. That includes things like issuing clearer guidance and regulations and prioritizing enforcement against organizations that aren't properly checking eligibility.
Okay. And enforcement, what does that look like?
Well, it calls for more cooperation between the Attorney General and Social Security and the AG and HHS for Medicare Medicaid to expand fraud prosecutor programs in U.S. attorneys' offices.
Focusing on what kind of fraud?
Specifically, identity theft and fraud committed by beneficiaries themselves. And it says to prioritize this in areas with large populations of undocumented immigrants.
I see. There are also some other points in there about audits and earnings reports.
Yeah, the Social Security Commissioner is told to fully implement recommendations from a 2023 Inspector General audit about missing death information, basically, making sure benefits stop when someone dies.
Makes sense.
And also to promptly refer earnings reports for people supposedly over 100 years old, where the name doesn't match the Social Security number to the IG for investigation. That could flag potential fraud.
Right. And one last thing.
The commissioner also has to review whether to start pursuing civil monetary penalties again under a specific section, Section 1129 of the Social Security Act.
Okay. So what's the likely effect of this on regular Americans who are legally entitled to benefits?
Well, the memo stresses making sure benefits go only to eligible people and cutting down on fraud and improper payments. If these efforts actually do reduce improper payments, it could maybe marginally help the long-term finances of these programs.
Yeah.
But it's important to recognize the language used, that heavy emphasis on illegal aliens is politically charged and, could be seen as divisive by many.
And any benefits for the wealthy or businesses from this?
Any benefit would likely be indirect, maybe through slightly reduced government spending if improper payments go down. But the actual scale of savings and the economic impact aren't really clear from the memo itself.
Okay, let's pivot now to the ocean. An executive order on restoring American seafood competitiveness. This one wants to boost domestic seafood and ease regulations on fishermen. What are the main proposals?
Yeah, the stated goal here is promoting U.S. seafood production, cutting back on what it calls unnecessary regulatory burdens for fishermen, fighting illegal fishing, IUU fishing, and protecting U.S. markets from unfair foreign competition. It argues that even though the U.S. has huge marine resources, our seafood industry is too heavily regulated, leading to a big seafood trade deficit, even when fish stocks are healthy.
So what does it propose doing?
Key actions include telling the Commerce Secretary to look at suspending or revising regulations that burden commercial fishing, aquaculture, and processing. It even wants heavily over-regulated fisheries identified within 30 days.
Now, quick timeline.
Yeah. And working with the regional fishery management councils to reduce those burdens.
Does it touch on technology or trade issues too?
It does. It tells the National Marine Fisheries Service, NMFS, to look into using cheaper, reliable tech and more cooperative research for fish stock assessments. Also, expanding programs for exempted fishing permits.
And trade.
Yes, it mandates an America First seafood strategy with the Ag Secretary to promote domestic production, marketing, exports, and processing. Commerce and the U.S. Trade Representative, USTR, need to assess competitiveness and develop a comprehensive seafood trade strategy.
Building on a previous one.
Right, from 2020. Focusing on better access to foreign markets and tackling unfair trade, including that illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. USTR is specifically told to look at the practices of major seafood producers, illegal fishing, forced labor, and consider responses like trade talks or enforcement.
Okay. And wasn't there something potentially controversial about marine monuments?
Yes, that's in there too. The Commerce Secretary, along with Interior, has to review existing marine national monuments and recommend if any should be opened up to commercial fishing, considering their original purpose.
Right. So what are the potential effects of all this on you, the listener?
Well, more domestic seafood could maybe lead to more affordable local options for consumers. That's the potential upside.
And the downside?
The proposed regulatory rollback raises big environmental questions. If not managed really carefully, it could impact the sustainability of fisheries and opening marine monuments to fishing. That obviously brings up ecological concerns.
Definitely a potential conflict there. And the likely business winners. Pretty clear, right?
Absolutely. The American commercial fishing industry, vessel owners, fishermen, processors, aquaculture, they all stand to benefit from less regulation, more fishing grounds, and potentially less foreign competition.
Okay. Let's turn to something that sounds a bit dry, but could have wide impacts. Federal office space management. An executive order about restoring common sense here. It revokes older orders that pushed agencies towards downtown areas and historic buildings. What's the reasoning?
The argument in this order is that those older directives, while maybe meant to help cities, have actually stopped agencies from moving to potentially cheaper locations elsewhere.
Uh-huh.
And the order says this focus on downtowns hasn't properly prioritized efficient government service delivery. So this new order cancels those old ones, EO 12072 and 13006, and tells the GSA, the General Services Administration, to change the rules accordingly.
And other agencies have to follow suit.
Yeah, agencies that get their own space are supposed to conform to where legally possible.
So the main driver seems to be cutting costs on office space. What's the likely impact on the average person?
Well, the main potential effect for you is if the government does save money by moving agencies to cheaper spots, that could theoretically benefit taxpayers eventually.
But there are other considerations.
Definitely. Moving federal offices could impact the economies of those central city areas they leave, and it might affect how easily some people can access government services depending on where offices end up.
Right, and who in the business world might gain or lose from this?
Commercial real estate owners outside traditional downtowns could see more demand for their properties. On the other hand, businesses in those downtown areas that rely on federal worker foot traffic might see a drop in business.
Okay, another order focused on efficiency, restoring common sense to federal procurement. This one targets the Federal Acquisition Regulation, the FAR, the big book of rules for how the government buys things. What's the problem it claims to solve?
The order claims the FAR has become, quote, an excessive and overcomplicated regulatory framework. It argues this complexity hinders efficiency and drives up costs. It mentions some negative reports but doesn't specify them.
And the solution proposed?
The stated policy is that the FR should only have rules required by law or rules absolutely essential for sound procurement and national security. Everything else, presumably, should go.
Okay. And what specific actions does it order to make this happen? To simplify things?
It tells the administrator of the Office of Federal Procurement Policy, that's within OMB, to lead an effort to amend the FR within 180 days. The goal is simpler, more user-friendly rules aligned with security needs.
Agencies have to help.
Yeah, each agency has to designate a senior official to work on FR reform and also on their own agency-specific procurement rules.
Yeah.
OMB has to issue guidance for consistency.
And it mentions that deregulation requirement again.
Yes, the 10-for-1 rule from a previous DO. For every new agency-specific rule, 10 old ones have to go. It also says to use deviation authority and interim guidance until the final FR changes are ready.
And one more thing about existing rules.
Right. The OFPP administrator and the First Council need to identify non-statutory rules that will stay, consider putting a 4-year regulatory sunset on them unless they're actively renewed, and include similar sunset provisions in new rules.
Okay. So the big idea is making it easier and cheaper for the government to buy stuff. How might this affect you, the average taxpayer?
Well, in theory, a more efficient procurement system could mean better use of taxpayer money. And maybe if it gets easier for smaller businesses to get contracts, that could boost the economy.
But there's a but.
Always. Cutting regulations needs careful balancing. You still need accountability to prevent waste and fraud in government spending.
And which businesses are likely to benefit most?
Businesses generally, but maybe especially smaller ones, might find it less costly and complex to bid for federal contracts if the FAR really gets simplified. The order also specifically mentions expanding the defense industrial base.
Okay, penultimate one. Back to the Pacific. A proclamation called Unleashing American Commercial Fishing. This changes rules for the Pacific Remote Islands Marine National Monument pre-IMM to allow commercial fishing in certain areas. What's the justification given?
The proclamation basically argues that allowing managed commercial fishing in parts of the monument wouldn't actually risk the things the monument was set up to protect the scientific and historic objects.
How so?
It points out that tuna and other big ocean fish, pelagic species, are migratory anyway and are already managed by NMFS and the Western Pacific Fishery Council. It also argues the previous ban hurt American fishermen economically.
Especially in places like American Samoa.
Exactly. It says the ban locked U.S. fishermen out of a big chunk of the U.S. Exclusive Economic Zone, the EEZ, forcing them to compete elsewhere and hurting territorial economies that rely on fishing.
So the argument is the ban was too strict and economically damaging, without adding much conservation value for those species. What exactly does the proclamation change?
It says commercial fishing will no longer be banned in the parts of the monument between 50 and 200 nautical miles from the island's land boundaries within the U.S. EEZ.
Preference for U.S. boats.
Yes, preference for U.S. flagged vessels. But foreign vessels can transship fish caught by U.S. boats, and the Commerce Secretary is told to change or repeal regulations that restrict commercial fishing there.
Okay. Potential effects for the average American.
You might see more Pacific caught seafood available, and potentially positive economic effects for places like American Samoa.
But the environmental concerns remain.
Big time. Opening up a marine national monument established for conservation to commercial fishing raises significant environmental questions about the impact on those ecosystems.
And the clear business winners.
The U.S. commercial fishing industry in the Pacific. Vessel owners, fishermen, processors, they get access to grounds they didn't have before.
All right, last one. A presidential memorandum on updating permitting technology for the 21st century. This is about modernizing the tech used for federal environmental reviews and permitting for infrastructure projects. What's the core problem it's trying to fix?
The memo says the current reliance on basically old paper-based processes causes significant delay for important infrastructure projects. The goal is to use tech to speed things up.
Okay. And what specific goals and actions does it outline?
The goals are pretty ambitious. Eliminate paper, speed up processing, make documents shorter and more accessible, reduce data duplication, get agencies sharing analyses better, cut down interagency friction, make schedules more transparent and predictable.
Sounds good on paper. No pun intended.
Right. Also, ensuring legal teams have tech support, streamlining the whole process, including for state, local, tribal decisions, and making sure info is kept for judicial review.
And the actions.
Mandates a permitting technology action plan within 45 days. This plan needs data and tech standards, minimum software requirements, a roadmap for a unified interagency data system, a governance structure, and a timeline.
Then agencies have to use it.
Right. They have 90 days after the plan is done to adopt the standards set by the Council on Environmental Quality, CEQ. CEQ also has to set up and lead an interagency permitting innovation center to design and test prototype tech tools for NEPA reviews and other permits.
And GSA helps.
Yeah, GSA's technology transformation services are supposed to support the innovation center.
Okay, so using tech to cut red tape and permitting. Potential impact on regular Americans.
Well, if it works, faster permitting could mean quicker completion of infrastructure projects, roads, bridges, energy stuff that could create jobs, maybe improve quality of life. And more transparency could be good for the public, too.
And the business benefits.
Businesses involved in building infrastructure would likely be the main beneficiaries. A faster, more predictable permitting process could save them a lot of time and money.
Okay. Well, we've certainly covered a lot of ground, a wide range of these recent executive actions. Looking back across all of them, what sort of key themes or patterns did you notice?
Yeah, a few things definitely stood out. There's a really strong theme of deregulation running through several of these federal contracts, seafood permitting, also a very consistent focus on domestic industries and interests. That America First idea comes through in the orders on seafood, critical minerals, procurement.
Right.
Improving government efficiency is another big one, office space, procurement reform, modernizing permitting tech. And then, of course, we saw those symbolic patriotic gestures like the Lexington and Concord Proclamation.
And as we've kind of talked about throughout, the intended effects written in these orders can often be quite different from the actual consequences on the ground, right?
Absolutely. It's so important to look beyond the headlines and the official statements. The real-world impact on you, the listener, on businesses, on specific policy goals that can diverge quite a bit from the stated intentions. You really have to consider the practical side, the potential unintended consequences.
Definitely. So as we wrap up this deep dive, maybe here's a final thought for you listening. Considering all these different executive actions we've just unpacked, what do you see as maybe the biggest potential opportunities and the biggest challenges for your own life and your community in the coming years?
Yeah, it's worth thinking about the longer-term effects, how these different policy changes might interact.
Exactly. And as always, we encourage you to actually go look at the source documents yourself if you want an even deeper understanding. Thank you for joining us for this edition of The Deep Dive.